Welcome, everyone, to my channel. I am Ben. Today, we will step into a mysterious land dispute turned into a chilling tragedy. A narrow village lane, no wider than 5 feet, that was supposed to connect two families. But instead of unity, it became the seed of endless quarrels, humiliation, and eventually, a life cut short. What truly happened on that cold November night? And why did a small strip of land carry such a heavy price? The morning cold settled over Dongming County like a thin film of frost, the kind that lingered in early November across the plains straddling Shandong and Henan, between fields and brick alleys. A phone rang at the local station, and an older man's voice cracked through a storm of noise footsteps, shouting, the wet sound of someone sobbing. He said his son, a middle school teacher named Athan, had been beaten at home and had died while they were still waiting for an ambulance. Then the line thinned to breath and panic. Officers rolled out at once. The scene breathed a rough, rural order. A blue 3-wheeled cart angled tight to a low brick wall. A white cotton quilt on its plank bed. A second red quilt folded over a body. The man beneath the quilts was the caller's son. He was local, a teacher, the sort of figure who kept a simple orbit students, parents, a few relatives in the village. The forensic doctor said the death was from catastrophic brain trauma. The blows had fallen again and again, the sort of blunt force that could have come from a hammer or a length of iron or even a brick. No weapon lay nearby. Whoever swung it had already left the morning to swallow their tracks. The first witness was the father, Mr. Lee, the same man who had placed the call. He told officers that just after dawn, around 6 in the morning, he stepped through the gate to wake his son for breakfast and found him on the cart, face and hair lacquered with blood, breathing in shreds. When he shook him, the teacher's eyes never opened. When he asked who had done it, the son's hand trembled up, tried to indicate someone in the dimness, then sagged back. The words stuck, where pain cages speech. The father kept talking, and the yard kept holding its silence. To understand why a man might be sleeping outdoors on a cart in the cold, the officers needed only a single step back in time. The family was rebuilding. In narrow village courtyards, new bricks had to live where space permitted, not on the cramped, hard-packed yard, but out along the lane where people passed all day long. Daylight was a guard of its own. Night demanded flesh and patience. So the teacher had been spending nights on the 3-wheeler to watch the stacks of sand and brick, a human lock for a home mid-rise. It was ordinary rural practice, the kind that grows out of necessity when alarms are a luxury and trust is negotiated with vigilance. Neighbors gave the officers something else to carry. In this house, family was complicated. The teacher was a stepson. The father, they said, favored his youngest biological boy. And even during the build, it was the teacher who took the quilt to the cart and the weather to his bones, while his younger brother stayed inside. On November nights, the air on the North China Plain ran thin and biting. In heavy rain, the man had slept under the eaves and waited for the locked door to open, but no one stirred. The resentment between a stepfather and a stepson had been long-lived, and the logistics of rebuilding only sharpened old edges. In a small place, every small unfairness grows teeth, because Mr. Lee was both the first on scene and a man with history knotted to the dead. Suspicion did not need much kindling to catch. Could a witness also try to be a witness on purpose? Someone who rearranged a few pieces before wearing the grief of discovery. Investigators did what they always did: first walk the rectangles of the yard, mark the prints, search for a weapon. But the search line turned up nothing. If the killer had been the father, he had not been careless. If it had been someone else, they had struck like weather, sudden and already gone. Then a different thread came in from across the lane. Since the day the new house rose, there had been a boundary quarrel with the woman who lived opposite, a neighbor named Akuk. The day before the killing, late afternoon, fading to evening, the two had screamed each other raw over land and walls, and finally crashed together. A scuffle that needed neighbors and village cadres to pry them apart. In places like this, the lanes are not just passage, but inheritance. A hand's breadth of space can become pride. Insult. Future parking. The width of a small car turned into a test of character. The officers wrote the names down and looked up at a doorway they would need to knock. They went to the neighbor's house and found only a child. The youngest daughter, Lena, maybe 10, stood in a kitchen with an empty morning in it. She said she was hungry. Asked where her mother was. She said her mother had left at first light and had not come back. Pressed gently. The little girl, still heavy with sleep, remembered the night. She had seen her mother return in the dark. She did not know what time it had been, and then leave again. Her arms wrapping the children in a quick, hard embrace before she slipped through the door. In the half-wakefulness of children, she had asked where her mother was going. The answer cooled the room. Her mother had said she had hurt the neighbor uncle, the teacher, and had to go. Then the door, and the quiet after a confession. The officers, veterans of lost tempers and long grudges, felt the case tilt. In these villages, where family honor and landmarks live close to one another, disputes heat quickly. Walls are not only bricks but promises about the future. A lane is not only a path but a pact. When a teacher and a neighbor woman fell into a feud loud enough to bring out cadres, it meant the quarrel had already ripened past the stage of polite words. Add the public sting of a slap, the humiliation of being struck by a man reputed to be a moral guide for children, and the night begins to germinate darker possibilities. That part of the story would arrive later, under lights and questions. For now, there was a body, a cart, a missing woman, and a child's fragments of truth. The human geography mattered as much as the map. Dongming sat at the seam of two provinces, Shandong and Henan, a borderland of dialect, shifts and bus routes that run farther than your paperwork can follow. In early 2002, identity checks were loose on cheap intercity runs. A person could vanish simply by stepping onto a night bus and naming herself Quiet. If the neighbor had fled, she could already be 2 counties away by noon, or just around the corner in a cousin's spare room. But absence is a loud thing in a village. People notice who doesn't come home. People notice which doors remain closed. The father, Mr. Lee, stayed under watch. But the center of gravity of the investigation moved across the lane into the house with the hungry child. The cart kept its angle against the wall. The red quilt kept its fold. The morning kept widening, and the officers, who had seen storms break over smaller reasons than this, began stitching together a timeline from ordinary materials, bricks in a lane, a man who slept outside to guard them, a quarrel in daylight, and a sentence a little girl remembered from the dark. Everything after that would depend on who the neighbor truly was once she stepped off her porch and into flight, on who might shelter her, on how many names a person can live under when a border is a road more than it is a line. For now, only this was certain. A teacher had died on a cold morning, and the wind coming down the lane carried more than weather. The house across the lane was still dark when the little girl stirred. In that thin hour before dawn, the door whispered, and her mother slipped in and held the children in a tight, breathless circle. The embrace was brief but hard, the kind that tries to say everything without a single word. When the girl Lina mumbled where her mother was going, the answer came low and terrible. She had hurt the neighbor, the teacher, and she needed to leave that very night. Then the latch clicked again, and the girl watched a departing silhouette through sleep-heavy eyes. The night kept it secret, but not well enough to smother a child's memory. By morning, the case had already begun to move like weather. Investigators sketched the radius of a flight, measured not in miles but in choices. There had been no bicycle taken. The old bike remained at home for the eldest boy to ride to school, so the first steps had likely been on foot, toward a road where buses and long-distance coaches threaded through the borderland between Shandong and Henan. These routes were the veins of rural life, cheap, frequent, and anonymous. If you could reach a coach at the right hour, the dark would do the rest. But flight is also arithmetic. The family was poor. A midnight escape rarely includes a purse full of options, and this one did not. In the house, police later found 300 yuan tucked beneath a pillow. A small hoard the mother seemed to have left behind for the children. It was enough for rice and kerosene, enough to keep a roof breathing for a few days, not enough for a woman to vanish in comfort. Money is a voice. 300 yuan speaks only of bare necessities and a hurried mind. From that arithmetic, the investigators built their first hypothesis: without proper documents, without savings, and needing food and shelter, a fugitive mother would almost certainly turn first to the warmest circle: close kin, trusted neighbors, someone who could hide her between work shifts and whispered errands. They canvassed her social map, knocked on doors that had once opened to her, walked the lanes where borrowed salt and old gossip made a common tongue. Even so, days passed with no trace. Formal steps followed: a wanted notice in Shandong and in Henan, a ring of alerts to township stations and county cadres on both sides of the provincial seam, and word to the public to watch for a woman who might already be using another name. In those early 2000 years, identity checks for bus tickets were lax, and one could cross county lines by paying cash and keeping quiet. The border, more road than wall, helped her slip between jurisdictions like a fish between fingers. Time is loyal to no one. By the end of 2004, 2 years from the night of the killing, a rumor arrived with the jumpy heartbeat of possibility. The suspect's younger brother, a man named Wang, had left Dongfang village abruptly for work in Dongying, Shandong, and joined a small crew that included an unfamiliar woman in her 40s who spoke in the tones of Dongping County. In villages, accents are maps. A few vowels can place you to within a handful of market towns. Police traveled to Dongying with hope and caution. They found the crew, but the woman with the familiar accent turned out to be Wang's sister-in-law, not the fugitive. The lead died in their hands as quickly as it had bloomed. Patrols and leaflet drops continued. The posters, printed on thin paper that curled in damp wind, showed a face that the village scarcely recognized. That failure had a reason hidden in plain sight. Poverty erases as efficiently as fire. In the suspect's house, there was not a single photograph, no wedding portrait, not even the small headshot that sometimes hangs threadbare in a frame. Even the marriage certificate to her late husband had been issued without a photo. Officers pried loose the only image available from the family planning office archives, a black and white close-up, years old, showing a woman with a triangular headscarf knotted beneath the chin, cheekbones high, hair falling flat along the temples. In the picture, people said she looked older, harsher, almost a decade beyond her years. A face like that, the villagers warned, was not the woman they knew in sunlight. If you had never met her, the poster would teach you the wrong eyes to seek. There was no better choice. In those years, you could not conjure portraits from pixels. There was only the dull mercy of a single grayscale square. That image went on every notice, and the world shrugged past it. The calendar kept turning. By early 2008, 6 years had drained away. Life had changed around the empty chair. The eldest son, now 22, was in the far south, working year-round in a machine shop in Shenzhen and returning rarely. The eldest daughter, 20, had married into a neighboring village, beginning a life framed by a different set of doorways and obligations. Only the youngest, Li Na, remained unmarried, living with her grandmother in Dongfang, where winter's breath still pushed dust along the lanes. The mother had become a story told in kitchens, a caution, a rumor caught in steam from boiling kettles. Absence had ripened into a fact. What kind of life survives in the seams between notices when your own children are aging past the last day they saw you? The record suggests something like a low, constant fever, half guilt, half calculation. You keep moving, but not far. Distance draws attention, while proximity can make you invisible. You avoid hospitals and schools, places with lists and stamps. You sleep where roofs leak, and questions are a tax no one wishes to pay. You look for work that pays cash and accepts silence a day on a construction site, a week washing bowls behind a stall, a season gathering someone else's harvest. You call no one from your past, and if you stand in a doorway with a relative and the dusk looks kindly upon you, you stay 3 nights and leave before dawn, so your gratitude does not become evidence. For the police, it was a study in patience, lacking a reliable photograph. They leaned on the human instruments at hand: dialects, kinship threads, purchase habits, bus timetables by memory rather than by record. They mapped alleys by whose dogs barked at strangers and whose did not. They read the social weave for stretches under strain, sudden trips to another city, a new mouth at a factory canteen, a rumor of a woman who keeps to herself and doesn't get paid by bank transfer. Every village headman knows the small anomalies in his square mile of dirt. The officers gathered these anomalies like pins. If the suspect had found shelter with kin, it would show in the rhythms of remittances, in the unseasonal purchase of rice, in the way someone hesitated half a heartbeat before answering a simple question, and yet the trail remained a haze. The original poster's face was an anchor that would not hold. Few in Dongfang trusted it. Fewer outside had ever seen the woman in the flesh. Under those conditions, the wanted circulars were theater acts of belief more than acts of recognition. Add to this the old convenience of the road in those years before stricter ID checks. A person with small means could travel with cash and a borrowed name, a border that is also a lifeline. Shandong to Henan, Henan to Shandong became a revolving door too slow to catch on film. The story of those years is the story of 4 roofs. The woman would eventually rest under some offering true shelter, some selling it dear. But before those roofs comes this broad, gray season of search and survival. A mother's last touch in the half-dark, 300 yuan, left like a whispered apology. The police drawing circles that matched not a fugitive's feet, but her needs. And a village learning how a person can remain present in every conversation and yet be gone in every way that matters. Here, the law and its subject share a single fact. Both must endure. One waits without a face the world will accept. The other waits without a trail the world can trust. Between them runs a road that has never learned to say no. The tip did not arrive as a confession from the suspect or a sudden eyewitness. It came as fear, carried by a young woman who ran through the lanes of Hongmiao village in Langkao on a damp May evening and burst into a police outpost with a sentence that did not feel survivable. Her stepmother had once killed a man. It was not a boast, she told them. It was a flare thrown in anger during a quarrel. And when the words cooled, she heard what they could mean. The stepmother had no proper papers. The only identification she carried was in another woman's name, her own mother's, who had died years earlier. The officers listened to the breathless account, to the accent that pinned them to the borderlands, to the small facts that make large shadows. Then they moved. 2 patrolmen followed the daughter home. Doors opened onto rooms where steam smelled of cabbage and damp brick. But the woman at the center of the story, this stepmother, was gone. She had packed quickly, the daughter said, before dawn. She had learned what panic looked like on a face. Neighbors offered fragments. The woman told people she was born in 1953, and her voice wore the tones of Dongming in Shandong, the county just across the provincial line. The year matched. Nearly. A different story the police knew too well. The wanted woman from Dongming Akuk was listed as born in 1957, close enough to be kin, close enough to be a disguise. The year she came to Langkao, 2002, matched the year when the fugitive from Dongming first vanished into the world. The lines began to touch. What held the lines together was not rumor, but plastic. The ID the stepmother used bore the name Huang Di, and that name, a tired household thing, was not hers. It had belonged to a dead woman, the late wife of a widower named Mr. Liu. A portrait expert came from the prefecture at the officer's request and compared the ID headshot to the wanted circular from Dongming. Different angles, different lighting, one mouth, one set of eyes. The conclusion was careful but firm. The woman called Huang Di and the woman wanted as A Kuk were the same. By the next day, Langkao notified Dongming, and a 15-year story began to unspool with fresh thread. The question that followed, how does a person trade one life for another, led the investigators to a winter nearly 6 years earlier. It was late December, the cusp of Lunar New Year, when families gather, hang red paper on doorways, and cook until midnight to welcome luck. A village acquaintance, a woman named Vin, came to Mr. Liu's home, leading someone in from the cold. A rag-wearing beggar, about 50, quick-handed, even in ruin. Mr. Liu's house had been empty of everything except his breathing. The daughters had married out or worked away, and grief had left the walls thin. He let the strangers stay through the holiday, promising meals for chores, a roof in exchange for order. Warmth begets attachment, and in a short season, the woman and the widower were living as husband and wife. Solitude laid down its arms. The woman said she was an orphan, friendless and paperless. Mr. Liu found a solution the poor sometimes choose when bureaucracy feels like weather. He took his late wife's old national ID, replaced the photograph, and paid someone to process a new card with the same name. The borrowed identity became a shelter with a lock. Under that roof, the fugitive was not a fugitive, but Madame Huang Di. For nearly 5 years, life moved in small, ordinary circles: market days, washing, repairs, a winter stove that burned a little too fast. No one asked for a past that could not be shown. Then, in early 2008, the world tilted. Mr. Liu drank too much one night and suffered a stroke that knocked the strength from his right side and much of the future from his house. The daughters returned in a rush. Their father was the kind of man who kept his keys in the same bowl for decades, and hospitals began their slow, expensive work. Feeding tubes and diagnosis sheets turned sympathy into arithmetic. In that arithmetic, the presence of a stepmother with no registrar's blessing felt like an insult and a threat. The daughters quarreled with the woman who called herself Huang Di. Their words grew sharp. Their suspicion thickened, month by month, into something they called protection. The house, once a refuge, became disputed land. Anger reveals what caution hides. In the course of those quarrels, the woman, whether exhausted or cornered, gave up a sentence she could not pull back. She had a past that did not fit the name on the card. She had once hurt a man. The daughters heard this as a claim to property and as a claim to danger. They wanted her out for reasons of inheritance and reasons of fear. And the stepmother, tasting the air, did what fugitives do, when rumor and paperwork begin to converge. She left before dawn. It was that leaving and the quarrel that came before it that led by the indirect route of a stepdaughter's fear to Langkao's patrolman and then to Dongming's case file. The officers assembled the broader map. If the woman had indeed come to Langkao at the end of 2002, if she spoke Dongming's tones, and if she used the name of a dead woman whose house she shared, then the years of invisibility made a bitter kind of sense. She had not run far. She had nested inside a relationship and worn it like a winter coat, heavy but warm. She had not bought tickets under cameras or crossed the country by train. She had traveled by foot, by borrowed rides, by the low science of keeping to edges, where no one checks a name against a face. In the early 2000 years, buses did not demand ID for cash fares, and county lines were more like promises than barriers. A person with no papers could become the kind of neighbor who is seen daily and never truly looked at. What made this case move again was the collision of two different kinds of memory. There was the administrative memory cards, dates of birth, household registers that could be fooled by a replaced photograph. And there was the human memory, which lives in vowels and cheekbones, and the way someone holds a bowl. The portrait examiner brought those memories into alignment. The daughter's fear gave the police reason to listen. The name Huang Di gave them a door to knock on. By the time the notification reached Dongming, the question had shifted from who she was to how she had stayed hidden under four roofs for so long, and what debt those roofs would try to collect when the truth finally stood up. This was not resolution, only the end of a season. The woman had already moved on, taking with her the quiet habits of survival cash, in small bills, a cloth bag, a posture that offered neither welcome nor challenge. The lanes of Langkao would return to their own business. The paper notices would turn at their corners in the wind. But the border's old courtesy, its willingness to let a person be one thing on one side and another on the other, was failing. A borrowed name had met a remembered face, and the space between them had narrowed to the width of a doorway. The pursuit could cross that distance. It would take more patience, and it would take the testimony of the next roof. Since that cold morning in early November 2002, when a middle school teacher was found on a blue three-wheeler under a white quilt and a red quilt, the skull shattered by repeated blows, the case had moved like weather across the borderland between Shandong and Henan. Patrol cars learned the lanes. Posters learned the wind. Yet every time the story seemed to tighten, it loosened again, like twine soaked in rain. The loosening this time began inside a house that had once been a refuge. Mr. Liu's daughters had long suspected that their stepmother, who called herself Madame Huang Di, was skimming money meant for their father's care, siphoning the small gifts. Relatives pressed into their palms on hospital visits into a private ledger. The quarrels were not abstract. They had a room-rattling heat. One day, rage rose to the rim and spilled. A daughter struck the stepmother and tried to throw her out. Something inside the older woman cracked open in return. She fought back, cursed, and half-boast. Half-warning, spat out a sentence that broke the room. "You don't know where I came from," she said. "I have killed." The words stayed in the air after the voices were gone. Before officers from the local outpost could arrive, she had packed in a hurry and slipped away into the pre-dawn, leaving the house stunned, and the daughters suddenly, terribly certain that the worst version of their suspicions might be true. The daughter's accusation and the stepmother's flight pulled the investigation's compass back toward a familiar point, Langkao's Hongmiao village, where months earlier, a young woman had run to a police booth with a confession she said was not hers to make. Her stepmother had once killed a man, had no proper papers, and was living under her own late mother's name. That tip had given the case new traction. Officers verified the adopted identity, compared the ID photo marked Huang Di against Dongming's wanted notice, and concluded, with careful confidence, that the woman they sought as a cook and the woman living with Mr. Liu were one and the same. But when the patrolman followed the stepdaughter home, the bed was cold. The stepmother had already gone. So investigators did what rural detectives do best. They read the human map. They found Avin, the villager who had once introduced the rag-clad stranger to Mr. Liu years before, and posted plainclothes officers in a quiet ring around her house. If the fugitive had fled again, gratitude and fear might pull her back to the first door that had fed her. At the same time, commanders gathered their sergeants over a table and widened the search in a way that matched the fugitive's history more than her footprints. For 5 full years, she had hidden in Langkou, near enough to Dongming to breathe the same dust, far enough to become a face that no longer drew company. If the pattern held, she would cling to the border seam, Henan to Shandong, Shandong to Henan, and seek the same kind of shelter that had kept her warm before. An older, solitary man, a widower, someone for whom a meal shared was evidence enough of character. Teams fanned out through market towns and alley webs, knocking on doors where middle-aged men lived alone, asking for the kind of stories no one likes to admit in daylight. The lanes offered nothing but silence. Silence lasted 3 years. In early May of 2011, nearly 9 years after the killing, a county policeman was visiting his cousin, Mr. Wang, during a short holiday break. Mr. Wang ran a baozi shop, hands white with flour, life heavy with the routines of boiling, folding, steaming. As they spoke, the officer's eye caught on an older woman moving in and out of the kitchen. Quiet and efficient, sleeves rolled, the posture of someone who has practiced not being noticed. "Who is she?" he asked. "A woman from Shandong," Mr. Wang said. "Someone who drifted in. No registration, no certificate, no marriage license. They simply lived together and shared the work. She had once asked only for meals, in return for chores and company. The policeman made small talk with her, listening to vowels and silences. She dodged gently, said she was an orphan, raised in hardship, the details of childhood lost to the fog. The officer did not press. He carried his unease back to the station, opened the drawer where wanted notices sleep, and leafed through the faces until one looked back at him with a familiarity that made his stomach turn. He called for a car. When they returned to Mr. Wang's shop, the woman was gone. She had seen the question in his eyes the day before and left while the steamers were still warm. It was an escape made possible not only by instinct, but by older failures. For years, the only usable portrait of the suspect had been a black and white, close-cropped image pulled from the township family planning file. A triangular scarf tied beneath the chin, hair flattened along the temples, cheekbones made harsher by the lighting. Villagers said the photo aged her by a decade. Outsiders who had never seen her in sunlight learned the wrong eyes to look for. Posters curled on walls and trained the public to miss her, even as identity checks on buses were lax in the early 2000s and payment in cash left no trail. The larger problem was simpler. You cannot find a face you do not recognize. That was how the years had lengthened. That was how a fugitive could stand behind a steamer basket and offer buns to a policeman and still, for one more day, remain invisible after the near miss. The search grid tightened again around the things the woman needed, rather than the footprints she left. Food paid in cash, a roof that asked no questions, a household that could explain a new body at the stove. The patrolman revisited the logic that had worked before. Watch the men who lived alone, especially those whose lives had bent under grief, whose houses had room for an extra pair of hands. They briefed shopkeepers and bus stop attendants on a woman who might be in her late 50s by now, who spoke in the tones of Dongming, but could mimic Henan's vowels if cornered, who avoided official counters and preferred neighbors' errands to anything that came stamped and logged. The border seam was no longer just a line on a map. It was the living premise of the case. A person could be one thing on one side, another on the other, and meet no questions, as long as she kept moving. And yet, to understand why the seam had held her so long, you had to return to the beginning and remember how the story had taught itself to be patient. A teacher dead on a three-wheeler, a father who discovered him at 6 in the morning, a neighbor whose quarrel over inches of lane had become humiliation by daylight and a confession by night, a child's sleepy testimony that her mother had hurt the neighbor, uncle, and had to leave. Every step since had been an echo of those first facts, played out in different houses under different names. Each new roof offered a pause. Each pause demanded a cost. Now the cost was rising. A confession blurted in anger had torn the lid from the borrowed life in Mr. Liu's house. A policeman's memory had nearly closed the door at Mr. Wang's, and the thin courtesy of the border was wearing through. What lay ahead would depend on the next roof, the one that would offer shelter at a price the fugitive could no longer afford to pay. Somewhere between Heinan's flat fields and Shandong's brick alleys, a woman in late middle age would knock on a door and offer her hands. Whether the house that opened would be kind or cruel, whether gratitude would turn to suspicion, whether love would turn into the kind of loyalty that obeys the law, all of that would compose the last movement of a song that had already played too long. 9 years after the murder, and after 2 near captures, the task force found itself circling the same immutable truth. If a fugitive still lives, the spine of her life will eventually bend toward home. A mother thinks of children. A daughter thinks of an elderly mother left behind. She will call, or send word through someone else, or knock in the night on a door that remembers her. That was the working faith, sharpened by many manhunts. Yet the woman from Dongming had left no print of love to follow. For years, she made no contact, not even when the youngest Li Na married in Henan in the first months of 2016. Even the family began to doubt that she was alive. The doubt lasted until a quiet afternoon. In October of the same year, word came from Zhengyang County in Henan. A woman around 60 had turned up at Li Na's home to see a newborn grandchild and stayed 3 days. She never stepped outside. When in-laws came to offer gifts and warm words, custom dictates visits in the first month after birth, a period of postpartum confinement known locally as Zuo Yuezi. When a mother rests indoors and relatives bring broths and small kindnesses, the visitor retreated to another room and kept her face turned away. Asked who the woman was, Li Na called her a maternal relative. The vagueness rang like a bell. Investigators drove south. They showed photographs, the same hard black and white portrait pulled from an old family planning file. The triangle headscarf, the cheekbones too sharply lit. The in-laws studied the paper. Then the memory of the woman who had refused conversation and nodded yes at Li Na's. When officers mentioned a cook's name, her composure thinned. She said she was tired and needed to rest. Tiredness can be mercy. It can also be refusal. The officers read the choice and did not push. They explained the law in plain terms. If you know a person is wanted for a violent crime and you provide shelter, money, or a false statement, you are no longer only a daughter. You are a harbor, and the law has words for that. Li Na had a husband and a 2-month-old infant. The words pressed, she wept. Then she spoke. Her mother had stayed 3 days. She had tried to give her money. The older woman had refused. Where she went after that, Li Na said, she did not know. Absence leaves a shape. If the woman had not boarded a coach or a train, tickets now required real names and real numbers, and if no purchase logs matched her face or age, then she had moved in smaller circles, on foot, in a hired taxi, or on the back of an electric bike. That meant her shelter lay near enough for a walk in darkness. The search grid shrank from provinces to parishes, from counties to clusters of streets. Notices went online. The reward set at 30,000 yuan, with WeChat accounts in nearby towns carrying the photo and the promise to every phone in reach. The circle tightened not on where she had been, but on what she needed. A roof that asked no questions, cash work, anonymity that felt like courtesy. On the 28th of May, 2017, the phone on a detective's desk trembled with a message from a local woman. Her neighbor looked exactly like the wanted notice. Officers verified the address, and by the 29th, they were in Lancao again, knocking on a door opened by a man surnamed Yao. The woman inside had white hair and a stillness that read as surrender before anyone spoke. When the officers began in the vowels of Dongming, the change in her face was not surprise but relief. She held out her hands for the cuffs without bargaining. She had been a fugitive for 15 years. She was 64. She had been living quietly with Mr. Yao. A simple routine, food for work, the kind of soft companionship that covers the day like cotton. She told them the broad shape of her years, walking, asking for bowls of rice when necessary, surviving in the rural margins where questions cost and silence pays. The arrest did not happen in isolation. It was the last movement in a sequence that had almost closed earlier. A county policeman had stared too long at a woman in a Baoji kitchen, felt an old familiarity, and gone back to his station to hunt through wanted posters until a face pinned his memory. He had returned the next day to an empty stove. She had read the change in his eyes and slipped away before dawn. One more time. Those were the near misses that season the end with caution. What the task force had misjudged was not love but discipline. They believed a mother would reach for her children and thus reveal herself. She did not. For 14 years, she let affection be a private fever. The visit to Lina came late, and even then she refused money, refused conversation with in-laws, refused to share a face that could be recalled. Fear does not cancel love, but it rearranges it. In October, she touched her grandchild in secret. In May, the law found her anyway. From a procedural standpoint, the case offers a field manual in thinking by needs rather than by trails. After the October visit, police did not only ask where she had gone. They asked how far a woman on foot could travel at night, how a roof could absorb one more person without gossip, which households could explain a new pair of hands at the stove, which bus stops would remember a quiet passenger who paid cash, which landlords would never ask for papers. They did not expect a perfect clue from a national system. They built a lattice of local likelihoods and then handed the lattice to the public. In an older decade, vigil posters curled in the wind. In a newer one, a reward and a headshot move through group chats and family threads. And an ordinary woman texts the state to say, "Look." As for the woman, her own telling was short. As if speech might spend the luck she had left. She sketched the roofs that had sheltered her Lu Wang. Then others, each with its price, each with its end. She had learned to keep to the border seam, where Shandong becomes Henan and Henan becomes Shandong. Because seams forgive small differences in accent and habit. She had learned markets by their smells and routes by which drivers never asked for a real name. She had learned that work paid in cash leaves no ledgers. She had learned that the human map is drawn in the same ink as mercy and suspicion. Those were the skills that carried her to 64. They could not carry her farther. In the end, the arrest scene was quiet. White hair. A man named Yao standing back in the doorway. A woman who, when she heard the sound of home in a stranger's voice, chose to stop running. On the charge sheet, the cause was simple: a killing born of rage and humiliation. After a daytime quarrel over a lane barely wider than a small car. The argument that had begun a decade and a half earlier with a red quilt on a blue three-wheeler. But a charge sheet is not a life. The years between were made of other people's kitchens, borrowed names, and the rule that you keep moving until you can no longer bear the cost. The law had finally outlasted her discipline. That is what laws sometimes do. After she fled Mr. Wang's Baozi kitchen, the woman from Dongming slid back to a life made of weather and chance. She begged. She slept wherever dusk allowed. Even a full stomach became a luxury counted on fingers, not days. By the time she reached the outskirts of Sanmenxia in Henan, she met another drifter, a man who, like her, carried no papers and few words. They shared a shelter little more than a hut, tolerated by villagers who chose kindness over questions. Two nameless people made a small order out of scraps. For a time, the world held. Then, in late summer of 2014, the man slipped and drowned, and the woman who had survived on borrowed roofs found herself alone again with a bag of clothes and a silence that did not comfort. She buried him as best as an outsider could, then walked on with no plan, no destination, only a habit of moving. Her steps eventually reached Minquan County in Henan. At a roadside, while asking for food, she met Mr. Yao, a widower, with a house that had more space than voices. He took her home. There, a bargain rebuilt itself from hunger and need. Work for meals, a body in a doorway that once framed no one. It was the fourth roof in 15 years. Lu Wang, the beggar's hut, and now Yao. And for a while, the days smoothed out. Gossip receded. A routine put its arms around the hours. At the end of 2016, a rumor crossed the lanes and slipped under her guard. Someone from Dongming had passed nearby with talk of births and weddings. The youngest daughter, Li Na, had married in Zhengyang County and was pregnant. The distance was not far, a few county lines instead of a province. The sort of journey one could manage by walking and rides begged from strangers. A mother's resolve and a fugitive's caution fought in the same chest. She chose the smallest risk she could bear. In late October, she set out without a ticket and without a name on any record, traveling by foot when she had to, on the back of a bike when someone offered, and by anonymous taxi when the road demanded it. She reached her daughter's home. She stayed 3 days. She never stepped outside when in-laws visited. And when asked who she was, Li Na called her a maternal relative, a phrase with room enough to hide a mother. Then the visitor left, before her face could root in anyone's memory. That visit changed the investigation more than any patrol. By then, tickets for long-distance travel required real names and numbers, and searches found no record for hers or for anyone who might be her. If she had not ridden the rail or boarded a coach, then her shelter had to lie within the radius of a night's walk. The task force shrank the map from provinces to neighborhoods. Notices went online with a reward of 30,000 yuan, about $4,400 at the time, pushed into local group chats, where a photo and a promise can travel faster than a van on a dirt road. The circle tightened around needs rather than footprints. A roof that did not ask. A stove that needed hands. A man who lived alone and believed that companionship was proof enough of character. On the 28th of May, 2017, a local woman messaged the police. Her neighbor looked exactly like the woman on the wanted notice. The next day, officers knocked on a door in Lankao. A man named Yao stood aside. Inside, a woman with white hair watched the officers' mouths form the vowels of Dongming, a sound that had followed her, border to border, lane to lane, Relief, not surprise, moved across her face. She held out her hands. 15 years had run to a stop. She was 64. The arrest closed a loop, first drawn with a red quilt on a blue three-wheeler, and a father's broken voice on a morning in early November. Under questioning, she was open about the years of flight. She described roofs and seasons, hunger and small jobs paid in cash, markets known by smell, drivers who never asked for a real name, the seam of Shandong and Henan that forgives small shifts in accent. But whenever the questions stepped back into the morning of the killing, her face tightened and her answers turned sideways, as if the past were a doorway too narrow to pass through. The officers understood the difference between shame and defiance. This was neither. It was a belief, half superstition, that a debt had been settled elsewhere. She had heard, more than once on the road, that the victim's family had hounded her eldest son until he took his own life, that her daughters had been bullied, that grief had been paid back with grief. If both houses had lost a life, what more could the law want? The officers heard the rationalization take shape. Then they broke it. They showed her 3 photographs. The son working in a machine shop in the far south. The daughters married, with children, lives intact, not hounded, not harmed by the victim's family. The air changed. So did she. Only then did they ask her to return, in words, to the narrow lane between the 2 plots in Dongfang village, to the argument that had outlived its purpose and become a wound. Years earlier, the families had agreed to carve a shared passage between their properties. Each would give up roughly 1.5 meters, about 5 feet, so that a small car could pass. One day, perhaps park, when the woman rebuilt first. She set her wall back as promised and opened her gate to that future lane. But in 2002, when the teacher's family rebuilt, their low new wall closed straight to the edge of their lot, erasing the shared path the 2 families had once spoken into existence. The space that remained was only what she had surrendered. His side gave nothing. Worse, construction materials spilled into the narrow strip she had left. The argument, born in inches and pride, ripened into humiliation. Pride gives no good orders, but people obey it anyway. The day before the killing, the dispute had ripped free of words. Neighbors and cadres had to pull them apart. In a village, a slap weighs more than a sentence. A public blow is a stain that hardens overnight. The next dawn opened on a courtyard, where a teacher slept on a 3-wheeler to guard bricks, on a father who would find him, on a neighbor whose rage had learned how to swing its weight. The weapon was never found, but the damage was beyond argument. A skull, broken by repeated blows. In the years that followed, the only portrait most people saw of the wanted woman was a black and white headshot from a family planning archive, a triangular scarf tied under the chin, cheekbones too stark for daylight, a face that looked a decade older than the one villagers remembered. A poster like that trains a public to miss the person in front of them. That is how the years lengthened. That is how a woman could offer buns to a policeman, read the change in his eyes, and leave before dawn to escape his recognition. The final months before the arrest were not clever. They were disciplined. A mother avoided every instinct except the one that protects her children from her shadow. For 14 years she did not call, not when the youngest married, not when rumors reached her that the family she had wronged had punished her own. She believed distance could count as penance. Then, in late October, longing outran caution. She touched her grandchild and left no name behind. In late May, the law knocked with the sound of home in its voice, and she stopped. What remained was the matter of truth, measured in feet and feelings. The officers asked her to speak the whole of it. How a promise about a shared lane became a grievance about dignity. How giving up a strip of ground about 5 feet can feel like giving up a future. How seeing the other side take all and return nothing can turn anger into action. They explain, again, what villagers already know, but sometimes forget, that a lane is not only earth, but an agreement about tomorrow. That a wall is not only bricks, but a statement about who matters. She listened. Grief is not a lesson, but it can be learned. When the photographs of her children's ordinary, unharmed lives settled the dust of her imagined blood debt, she began to answer cleanly. The story of the flight acquired an ending. The story of the morning acquired a voice. In the charge sheet, the case looked simple: a killing during a property quarrel, 15 years of evasion, an arrest in Lancao after an online notice and a neighbor's message. But a list is not a life. Between the first blow and the last door stood 4 roofs, 1,000 meals handed over in trust, and a road that allowed a person to be 2 things at once as long as she kept moving. The officers wrote their report. The village returned to its chores. Somewhere a narrow lane still waited for a car that would never need to pass. In the end, the story bent back to the narrow lane that had once been a promise years earlier. Both houses had spoken of carving out a shared passage, each giving up roughly 1.5 meters, about 5 feet, so a small car could pass one day, park without scraping pride off either wall. Then, when reconstruction came to the teacher's yard, the line went straight to the edge of his lot, and the promise collapsed into dust. The space that remained was only what the neighbor had surrendered, and even that strip began to fill with his bricks. When she shouted across the lane to ask him to pull his wall back, he refused and told her to tear down her own side if she wanted the ground back. In the village, words like those are more than words. They are a measure of what you think someone is worth. That afternoon, before dark, he slapped her once, hard, and kicked her as the crowd pulled in a breath. That night, humiliation hardened into a decision. She stepped out into the cold and saw him sleeping under quilts on the blue 3-wheeler, guarding the construction materials. A length of wood lay by the wall. She picked it up and struck his head, again and again, until anger no longer had a voice to use. She ran, because running was the only verb that fit a life at that hour. At home, she laid 300 yuan under a pillow for the children, the eldest, 16. The youngest 10 told them to look after one another, and slipped into the door. Later, the little one, Lina, he would remember her mother's breath and the sentence that broke the night open. She had hurt the neighbor, uncle, and had to go. In the emptying house, grief and fear took their places around the table, and the lane outside kept its width like a dare. What came next stretched across 15 years and 4 roofs. A road discipline learned by hunger. She hid under another man's dead wife's name in Lancao, lived for seasons in a widower's house as Madame Huang Di, and almost surrendered herself in one moment of fury when the stepdaughters accused her of skimming money for their father's care. "You do not know where I came from," she had snapped. "I have killed." By the time the officers were brought to the door by a frightened young woman, the stepmother had already packed and vanished. The old photograph on the wanted poster, black and white, triangular headscarf, cheekbones, made severe by bad light, did the rest of the work for her, teaching strangers' eyes to miss what stood right in front of them. There were other near captures. A county officer stood in a Baozi kitchen and felt a familiarity he could not name until he went back to the station and turned pages in a drawer of faces. He returned the next day to an empty stove. She had seen the small change in his eyes and left before dawn. Each escape thinned the odds and thickened the resolve. The border seam between Shandong and Henan kept forgiving the small shifts in accent and habit that keep a person ordinary. And buses in the early 2000s took cash without looking for names. She learned to be one thing on one side and another on the other. A courtesy the seam had offered travelers for generations. By the time the calendar turned to late 2016, she had settled into a modest rhythm with Mr. Yao, a widower, who measured days by meals and chores. Then a rumor threaded through the lanes. The youngest daughter had married in Zhengyang, and a child was on the way. Customs in northern villages hold fast to Zuo Yuezi, the month of postpartum confinement, when a new mother remains indoors and relatives bring broths, eggs, and small kindnesses to rebuild a body that has just given life. The mother chose that customs cover. She walked and hitched and rode quiet taxis to her daughter's door, stayed 3 days, and never stepped out when in-laws visited. Asked who the visitor was, Li Na called her a maternal relative, a phrase wide enough to hide a mother. Then the older woman left, before her face could root in anyone's memory. That visit shifted the investigation. Real name ticketing meant there was no record of her buying a berth or coach seat. Therefore, her shelter had to be near enough for night travel on foot, by bicycle seat, or by an unlogged cab. The task force shrank the map from provinces to neighborhoods and pushed a reward notice online. 30,000 yuan, roughly $4,400. At the time pulsed through local group chats, carrying a face and a promise to every phone. The grid tightened around needs, not footprints. A roof that asked no questions. A stove that needed hands. A man who lived alone and believed companionship was proof of character. On the 28th of May, 2017, a woman texted the police to say her neighbor looked exactly like the photo. Officers verified the address. On the 29th, they stood at Mr. Yao's door in Lungkao. Inside, white hair, a stillness that read as surrender, and a face that changed, not with surprise but with relief, when the vowels of Dongming crossed the threshold. She held out her hands for the cuffs. She was 64. 15 years had reached their stop. In interrogation, she spoke freely about roofs and seasons, markets known by smell, drivers who never asked for real names, and the old grace of the border that lets a person be two things as long as she keeps moving. But when the questions returned to the morning of the killing, she turned away, not defiant so much as persuaded by a superstition that the debt had already been paid. On the road, she had heard the rumor that the victim's family had hounded her eldest son into despair and punished her daughters. If both houses had lost a life, what more could the law want? The officers broke the story gently. They showed 3 photographs. The son working year-round in a machine shop in the far south. The daughters married with children, ordinary lives intact. The air changed, and so did she. Only then did they ask her to speak the whole of the lane. Years earlier, the village cadres, local mediators, who carry both authority and neighborliness, had tried and failed to turn quarrel into compromise. On the afternoon before the killing, the argument had boiled into a public blow, and in small places, a slap weighs more than a sentence. Pride, once wounded in daylight, seeks its medicine in the dark. The weapon was never recovered, but the damage was written into bone. A skull, broken by repeated blows. A teacher's body on a 3-wheeler, under a white quilt and a red quilt, and a father's voice on the phone the next morning, shredded by panic and grief. In September of 2017, the court sentenced her to 15 years. At the reenactment, when officers brought her back to the old lane, she found that time had revised the map. Her former house had been sold. Across the way, the teacher's family still lived behind their rebuilt wall, and the lane, at last, had been made whole again. The teacher's side, pulled back by roughly 1.5 meters, about 5 feet, restoring the shared passage both families had promised before they taught the village a different lesson. She said she was sorry for the impulse that had carried her past reason and into irretrievable harm. Sorry for the years her children grew up under other roofs, and sorry for the woman who had learned to disappear so well that even her own life could barely find her. What remains after judgment is the part people use to warn each other. Land is worth more with every season of development. A few meters can be the difference between a narrow path and a future. But a lane is not only earth, it is an agreement about tomorrow, a statement households make about who matters and how much. When promises fail under a mason's line and a teacher's hand rises in daylight against a neighbor who has already given more than enough, a private humiliation becomes a public calculation. Violence is the interest charged on pride. In this case, a shared passage widened again, only after a life had been narrowed to a sentence and 3 children had learned the geography of loss. The law came late, but lasted longer than discipline. The lane, finally, learned to keep its width. The living will have to learn the rest.